This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. This is Series 3 of Platemark. I'm interviewing people who occupy various roles in the print ecosystem. My guest today is Chris Santamaria. He is the director of Joni Weyl, which is the gallery that represents Gemini G.E.L's production. It is in New York. That's where Chris works. The workshop, Gemini G.E.L, is in L.A., so they have this really interesting relationship. Chris is the director of the gallery, and I wanted to talk to him about not only Gemini's history, but the business of the business and being a director of a gallery in New York, but also because he's an artist, I want to talk to him about his own work. All right, let's see. Housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Images will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. And if you love Platemark, please consider going over to the website, platemarkpodcast.com, and hitting support and donate. Your support would be most appreciated. All right, buckle up. Let's get rolling. Chris, wonderful to see you. Thanks for coming on Platemark today.
Oh, it's my privilege to be here. Thank you so much for asking me.
You have been on my list from day one, so I'm glad you're here.
That's good to hear.
Can you introduce yourself for the listeners?
Yeah, my name is Chris Santamaria. I'm the director of Gemini G.E.L at Joni Weyl Gallery here in New York, where we exclusively represent the publications of the Gemini G.E.L workshop based in Los Angeles. I've been here in this role for almost 15 years now, but I'm originally from Arizona, where I got a BFA in painting and art history. I do have a studio practice on the side, kind of moonlighting as an artist, but here I am at Gemini full-time, basically representing the workshop in terms of any new projects that get made. We frame them, we put them on view, we do exhibitions of older publications if we don't have any new things coming out. So some of that's kind of curated based on historical projects. And the point is to sell that work and place it and represent it in a way that can support the workshop that's in Los Angeles and keep it going so we can keep inviting artists to come out and do new projects.
I'm trying to think of another publishing workshop that has a gallery arm in quite the same setup. I can't think of one. Can you?
Well, I can't either. I mean, ULAE has a small little kind of apartment space where Marie Tennyson will have some flat files and can open things up and show things by appointment, but not on that sort of scale that Gemini has. Like, this is a 3,000 square foot gallery. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. We do by appointment viewings. I have walk-ins all the time coming in and saying, hey, can I look at a Richard Serra etching? Or do you have anything by John Baldessari or Julie Mehretu? And so we have the ability to really open up our drawers on a moment's notice and be nimble to show a really wide and deep breadth of what Gemini G.E.L has published in the last 55 years.
55 years. Okay, so for listeners who are unfamiliar with Gemini and its history, can you do a short bit on the history?
Sure, yeah. So it started in 1966 with three guys, Stanley Grinstein, Sidney Felsen, and Ken Tyler. So Ken Tyler was the master printmaker that came and brought those skills to the workshop. And in the beginning, it's my understanding that we would just be able to do lithography, and slowly expanded out to have an etching workshop. Ken Tyler left in 1972 to start his own publishing workshop in upstate New York. But that didn't stop Gemini, because at that point, we'd already started working with some pretty big names. I mean, the first project that Gemini did was with Josef Albers, with those kind of white line square classic color theory images, really, really, really beautiful prints. In a way, the relationship that Josef Albers had with the Black Mountain College and Robert Rauschenberg being there, there's a lot of these kinds of connections that were based off of all these social networks that were already in the art world. So Rauschenberg comes to work at Gemini in 1967. He obviously has some friends in New York, Jasper Johns, Klaus Oldenburg, Frank Stella, Roy Lichtenstein, Ellsworth Kelly. This is really kind of like the golden era of Gemini, when all of these really, really, really great post-war American artists started to get invigorated by the medium of printmaking. And so Gemini expanded even more to have a screen printing workshop and really to do some crazy projects. Klaus Oldenburg wanted to do different kinds of multiples that had mechanics involved, sculptures. Sidney is always saying that we have these master printers on hand that are better at making prints than the artists are, but the artists are better at making art than we are. So there's this collaboration that happens, and Gemini is notorious for not saying no to an artist, even if it's really, really complex and it's something that's never been done before. There's always this kind of mentality that we'll experiment and we'll try things out. And even if we can't do the thing that the artist wants to do, maybe something new will come out of that process of trying to create something that you've never made before. So Gemini's really just the heart of it is just like any other printmaking endeavor. It's about collaboration. It's, the printer and the artist coming together as one, and they're creating something that they normally wouldn't be able to do when they're on their own in their studio. So it's really it's a beautiful, wonderful history that Gemini has. And so I feel like every time I come here, it's 15 years now, and it's like I'm 2 years younger than s3e was when he started Gemini.
Oh my.
And I've already been doing this for 15 years, and it's just kind of I learn new things every single day, not only about printmaking, especially with the community of the different printmakers and artists that come into the gallery or that come to the print fairs. It's a different kind of community that's more tight-knit and open and transparent and friendly than the larger art world, between a lot of the galleries that are very competitive, and they have these kind of turfs where they keep their artists separate from different sort of things, where printmaking is all about coming together.
Is there a story about the name Gemini? I've always wondered.
Yeah, so I've heard a couple things. So 1966, you've got the Gemini space program that NASA's got out. And so the word Gemini, I think, is out there in pop culture. I think that there's also a connection with the kind of the horoscopic version of Gemini being, and I'm not really a horoscope guy, but astrology, but is it about like two different personalities, I think? And so I think maybe that had something to do with Stanley Grinstein and s3e Felsen. But G.E.L, everyone calls it Gemini G.E.L, but G.E.L stands for Graphic Editions Limited. But it has a kind of smooth, Gemini G.E.L. So
it works. Yeah, the Gemini is the twins. My brother's a Gemini. It's the twins, and for him, it means that he sees both sides of things, and sometimes it makes it hard to decide stuff. That's the thing that comes through in him. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Like having both sides being one surface to the other. I mean, that kind of relates to printmaking right there. Yeah.
Maybe that's part of it, huh?
I don't know. Subconsciously, maybe that's part of it for sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Paging Jennifer Roberts. Okay. But s3e becomes the figurehead. I mean, in the beginning, s3e and Stanley, do they each take on aspects of the business, and then they kind of phase into what it is now?
Yeah, I think so. I think, they both had different things that they brought to the table for how to run the workshop. And clearly it worked out pretty well because Gemini was so successful and is still making prints, and we've got this gallery here today. s3e, he's got this really wonderful office that's in the center of Gemini. And when you walk into it, you've got this beautiful skylight where all this LA light is kind of coming into the space. And he's got all these photographs up on the wall that go all the way to the ceiling of all the different artists. And, even some famous people that came through, because being in West Hollywood, you've got this connection to Hollywood. And every once in a while, we're going through these photographs that s3e has taken. And it's like, is that Dustin Hoffman hanging out with Robert Rauschenberg? And it's like, is that Gregory Peck? I'm like, what is that? What's going on in the background there? So there's always this kind of crossover, and especially with the workshop being a kind of open and welcoming place, I'm always sending people there to go see how the sausage is made, so to speak. And you can open up that door and you can smell all of the chemicals, the inks. There's just nothing like it to see how a print is made, as opposed to being here in the gallery where I'm trying to kind of describe it with words. I have a couple of different tools here, like a little etching plate, and I've got a needle and I've got a brayer, but it's not the same as being in the space where all that's happening. But s3e's space is like he's in the middle of Gemini. And so he's there every single day. And even at 99 years old, he's in there. I think it's not like a full day, but he's got his typewriter, he's got all of his colored pencils, and he's got these drawers with all of these amazing stamps that he uses to send out. Whenever he sends out the royalty checks to the artists, if we sell something, he'll do a whole collage of stamps, and he'll write sort of different things and do different kinds of stamps. And so the hand making and arts and crafts and fine art, all of it is like, I don't know, that space that he has in the middle of Gemini is like the singularity. It's like the convergence of all of this all of this stuff. So Stanley, I think there's a lot going on at Gemini. It's not just the workshop. There's also a sales team at the front. There's a gallery at the front. We expanded Gemini, I think, in the late 80s with Frank Gehry designing our etching studio. And on the top, there was an exhibition space that was kind of a classic old plywood Frank Gehry building. And so there's lots of components to the shipping department. And so Stanley being there to sort of handle some of those things, it's a team effort. It clearly worked out. They were just frat bros at USC. And so they were, it's like they had a midlife crisis. Sydney was an accountant and was taking art classes at night. And then him and Stanley started talking about collecting art. And they heard about you could buy these portfolios of prints from European dealers where you could get like a Chagall and a Dali and a Picasso and like one little portfolio. And then they were kind of like, why don't we just open up a print shop? Then we could like make prints and we could also collect them at the same time. And so it just exploded from there. So it became much, much bigger, I think, than they both could ever have dreamed of. And it's one of the reasons why I'm here. So
that's right.
I'm eternally grateful to both those guys and Ken Tyler as well. He was there for the first 5 years to get it up off the ground.
It does seem like a sort of the golden era, because at that point there were the big painters, the big boys, the painter peoples got a whiff of this thing and started doing it. So there was this, I don't know, it seemed like it all was a confluence that just worked, where I think all the younger shops now are working really hard.
I know. There's so many of them too. I'm just like overwhelmed every time I go to the Editions and Artists Book Fair, and even at the print fair, where you've got some of these smaller publishers that are kind of attending it and seeing how a lot of the bigger publishers are working. And you're just constantly meeting these students that come out of printmaking programs and wanting to open up their own shops and collaborating with artists on a whole variety of projects. It's kind of insane. I mean, if you go back to the 50s and 60s with this, like, you've got Tatiana Grossman, S&Well AE, and you've got Crown Point Press. Some of these bigger things come up, but it's not like there wasn't 150 printmaking workshops in the country, and so now there's just thousands of them. It's like every state or every university campus has got something going on, and I can't keep track of it. But it's really difficult. It's really hard work to make a print and to collaborate with an artist and have everything kind of go smoothly to the point where you're actually signing that BAT or that RTP, and then cranking out the edition and then trying to sell it so you could keep that workshop funded. It's very, very difficult. And, even I think some of the larger galleries nowadays, as they turn their gaze and get more interested in what printmaking is, not only as a medium for the artist to articulate some of the ideas that they have within their work, but also as a marketable product. I mean, it's interesting that some of the bigger galleries are getting involved with it, but, Gemini's been around for a long time, and it's like, it's like a smooth machine, but it's like also like a really big ship. So you can't like turn it right really fast, so like everything goes very slowly. You start working with an artist and it's like, you're talking like a 1 year, 2 year commitment just to get that project to come to the publishing stage or being framed and put up in the wall here at the gallery in New York. But yeah, my role here is to represent Gemini and to sell these publications so we can keep the workshop funded for the future. And it's hard. Some of the smaller publishers, they don't have the ability to have like a tiny little satellite gallery that exclusively represents that workshop, or they may not have the breadth of publications that go back so many years. So there's a lot of other factors that go into Gemini being what it is. But man, it's kind of wild to watch these younger kids. They have so much energy and they're just so into printmaking, and they ask all the right questions, and they're really in the nitty gritty, like, well, how do you do this and how do you do that? And it's like, well, we do it this way, but I've heard that ULAE does it that way. And so I keep going back to this kind of like community that printmaking is. It's all about sharing this knowledge because everybody loves prints and wanting to see like the skills and the ideas that go into printmaking. So it's great.
Well, the interesting thing about these beginnings in the 50s of all of ULAE, Tamarind, Crown Point, all of that in the 60s, you're right, nothing was happening. It was as all of those university departments were being formed by people who had come out of Hayter's Atelier 17.
Yeah.
So there's this post-war kind of spreading of things and necessitated by the GI Bill and all those people wanting to take art classes. So it's so fascinating how the history is all intertwined, Nothing happens without the other.
Yeah, it's like a pollination. I mean, it's really sort of an expansion and an unfurling of different kinds of skills and ideas. But it took some time, and it took just the right kind of scenario. Oh, there we go. There's
There's
some paw
Lucy.
prints right there.
All right, everybody, you get to see Lucy on our camera today.
You can't cut that out. That's quality material right there. Give the people what they want.
Also, the idea about how long it takes for a publication to come to fruition and get onto the wall in a frame. When you're a curator and you're watching what Gemini's doing and what ULE is doing, and you say, oh, that would be perfect. And then, suddenly you're sitting there waiting for 2 years, and it's so frustrating. But
yeah,
I don't think we've ever really described how long the process is and exactly what the steps are. Would you mind running through that?
Totally. Okay, so a lot of artists, they'll come into the gallery and they're like, how do I work with Gemini? Like, tell me what do I need to do to start up a project at Gemini? And I think that the easiest way for me to describe just how complicated and long of a process that can be is going back to how Julie Mehretu started working at Gemini in 2010. And it really started about 7 years before that when Sydney picked up Elizabeth Murray from the airport. And he was always asking the artists that we were working with, like, who are you interested in these days? What are the younger artists that you're seeing that we should keep our eyes on and possibly invite to the workshop? And she was like, you got to check out Julie Mehretu. She's amazing. And she's got this show at the Red Cat Gallery in LA. We could go to the opening and you could meet her tomorrow night. And Sydney's like, yeah, of course. And so they go and they meet her. And, this is like Julie just sort of come out of RISD. She's doing all these large scale paintings they kind of look like arenas with all these little flags and just kinds of intersecting lines, the earlier work. And, Sydney and Joni and everybody's blown away by this artist. And she was already kind of hot, like a star. But, we invited her to the workshop, but I think it took like 6 to 7 years to finally get a project going. And I think some of that had to do with the artist's schedule, all of different kinds of shows that they were already committed to with the gallery. But she was very, very ambitious, and she did come to printmaking with an extremely deep knowledge of etching. She fell in love with etching at grad school. I think one of the stories is that when she saw Rembrandt's Three Trees, that was something that sort of like expanded her understanding of what was possible with printmaking. Like the way that Rembrandt articulated the little clouds. I mean, it looks like a little miniature Julie Mehretu inside there. And so I can see where she would be like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And she's a particularly kind of, an artist that works with layers, and her process is always about, even in the paintings, you've got printmaking elements that are underneath painterly elements, this kind of calligraphy, just a constant layering. And printmaking is a way that sort of slows down that kind of layering process. And the artist has to think about, what goes on top or under or next in terms of making marks. And she was just she's a genius. But at the same time, she's pushing our master printer, Case Hudson, to do things that he had never done before with aquatint etching, different kinds of techniques like a la poupée. And so there's this evolution that comes out of the collaboration between Case and Julie that goes back all the way to 2010. So the prints look different from the earlier work, and Julie's work looks different from the earlier work, but they kind of evolve in lockstep with each other by pushing each other to do things that they normally wouldn't consider to be possible on a printmaking project. So everybody's always asking, like, how do I get into Gemini? How do I get into Gemini? I'm like, listen, get a couple shows, get reviewed in a couple of publications, try to get a monograph published about you, and get a community that supports you, because a lot of the connections that we find, or a lot of the artists that we collaborate with, come from, the gallery. Like John Baldessari introduced us to Anni Saban, who was his student at UCLA. And so the connection between Elizabeth Murray and Julie Mehretu working with Marion Goodman and being friends with Tacita Dean, and John Baldessari was also showing at Marion Goodman. And so sometimes it's the galleries that become a kind of social node in which we can connect with a certain artist. We try to pay attention to a lot of the younger artists that are coming up in this world, and trying to get a sense for whether or not they'd be interested in printmaking, or if they're already well-versed in understanding the medium, whether or not their work would translate to some kind of print project. And it's not really our job to determine those things at the front end of it, because once they get into the studio and they start collaborating with the printmakers, that's when things can go crazy or wild, or they go into all these different directions. But it takes years for us to kind of work it in, because like we've got things scheduled out. It's like so slow. It's like, is Terry Winters going to do another screen print with us? And are we going to finish up that project with Tacit Dean in 2 years so we could maybe get another Richard Serra large scale project fit in there? And so a lot of it just comes down to like the kind of boredom of scheduling things and making sure that you can, like, you know, if nothing goes wrong with one project in the front end, then you can kind of guarantee that you can book another artist in the back end or front end, whatever it would be. So logistics.
Yeah, like you need an air traffic controller. But the way you're talking and describing the natural flow of artists into your system makes it sound like they are artists in other media, and are either new to printmaking or have some, but they're not printmakers.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. I mean, sometimes artists will do a print project with a university press, and so they'll come into it with a baseline understanding of what like aquatint etchings are or lithography is. But there's other artists, like we didn't collaborate with Richard Tuttle until he was, you know, way into his career. And so when he came into the workshop, he was like, I want to do something with paper pulp, and I want to take these copper plates and I want you to burn them so they're so hot so I can hammer them with a nail. And then we want to emboss them on the paper, and then I want to do some, you know, custom little drawings in here and there. So he kind of came in with, you know, wild kind of wacky notions about what a print could be. And so he could talk your ear off about, you know, all of these different techniques and things that make a print. And so, you know, it just depends. Rauschenberg came to Gemini and he was like teaching us how to do transfer techniques, I think. I mean, he was already inventing things at ULAE in like the late 50s with those Dante's prints, those black and white images where he was transferring different kinds of photographs just to get them onto the lithostone without wiping off every time you would run it through the press. Or, you know, he kind of came to the workshop with that knowledge. And of course, Jasper Johns was already obsessed with printmaking, the mirroring of images, the multiplicity of images, all the different kinds of variations that you can get in types of projects. And so it's really, you know, every artist just comes in and totally changes the energy of the workshop. And they're usually paired up with a printmaker that matches that kind of mentality or the sentiments that they have, the different kinds of skills that they bring and the different kinds of skills that Gemini can bring. And hopefully something magical happens afterwards. But yeah, you know, when Jasper was there, there was definitely, you can see, I wasn't there, but I can see all of these photographs that s3e took. And it's like, you can tell that there's this kind of seriousness there. There's, you know, a kind of quiet intensity. And then you got these pictures of when Rauschenberg's there and there's like a bottle of Jack Daniels on the press and the TV's on in the background with Days of Our Lives playing. And it's like, there's this, like, you can tell that there's a sensory thing and there's people hanging out, you know, there was like a social element to it. And some of those things, they feel like they're kind of reflected and they kind of come into the work in a different way. So yeah, I don't know. Everybody kind of brings their own skills to the table.
Right.
To the press.
Yeah. You guys have a big shop. And now it's obvious that, I think it's obvious, tell me if I'm wrong, that there's a team, Richard Serra, and there's a team, you know, like each artist has the person and team that they're comfortable with. But
yeah,
does it follow that team is the etching team for Serra? Because he doesn't usually work in other things? I
think a lot of our printers are capable of, you know, I know that Javier Fumat, who's been our master etcher and master connection with Richard Serra, I mean, the projects that they were able to accomplish in the last couple decades is just truly mind-blowing. Some of the scale, some of the techniques that they were using and etching into the plates for hours on end to create an overall foul bite. I mean, the whole process of lifting up plates from chains and dipping them into vertical tanks of ferric acid. I mean, it's just like, I hear these stories about that, but I know that Javier can make a lithograph because he was doing some of the early lithographs with Ellsworth Kelly when he first started working at Gemini. So when I go through the catalog and I'm seeing which of the master printers that worked on things, you know, you have this kind of crossover where sometimes they'll do an etching project and they'll come back to lithography. But there's other cases where you've got screen printers and I've talked to them and they're like, I don't touch lithography, man. That stuff's way too hard. I don't even mess with that. So don't put me in that room. You know, I'm cool right over here in this area of expertise. So it depends. And
it's also a big shop. How many, at full capacity, how many printers are on the press?
Full capacity, I think it's like, it feels like it's 10 to 12. The last project that we did with Julie Mehretu, which was very, very large scale, very complex techniques, over 50 copper plates that were like, 32 by 42 inches each. I think there were 6 full-time etchers working on that project. Whereas if you go into the litho studio and they were working on Tacita Dean's last project, which was the LA Magic Hour lithographs that look like these beautiful sunsets. They're all made by hand. They look like photographs, but they're not photographs. There's 3 lithographers working on that at the same time. But that was because we had like a 45-pound blend roller. And so there's 2 printers on each side of that, like they're sawing a big redwood tree. And then you've got, someone else that's there with the sponge on the litho plate. So there's definitely like this kind of stately ballet between inking the plate and running it and pulling the paper off. And so watching it is just, it's incredible. There's a lot of people who, once they start to understand a little bit like what goes into printmaking, they can start to really enjoy it more or appreciate it more. And for me, it was like, I was forced to take an etching class in college and I hated it so much. But I got out of it an appreciation for the medium in a way that was different than just looking at it, So yeah, I always encourage people like, I don't know, I'm interested in printmaking. Like, how do I find out more about it? I'm like, look, Niels Bork Jensen's got some great videos on his website. They're really, really beautiful, talking about all the different kinds of etching processes that he's a master at. But the real way to do it is maybe sign up for a class at Robert Blackburn workshop and get your hands dirty and sort of play around with it. So I don't know. People who seem to be fascinated or interested in printmaking, it kind of is a rabbit hole. It just goes down and down and down because there's just so much to know about the history of it. And there's also so much to know about the different technologies that are being used today with some of these old school processes to create new kinds of prints that I think would make artists in the Renaissance blush. So,
oh, that's an interesting thought. So in Julie's, the most recent, she did 2 large scale etchings that you debuted at the print fair in New York, I think. The ones with 50 plates for each product. It's crazy. So when you say there's 6 printers on it, when they're creating the image in the plate, what does that ballet look like versus when they go to additioning, which I'm sure it takes a ton of people?
Yeah, I think the additioning process, right when they get to the point where they're, one team is inking a black and white plate, one team is inking the other colorful plate that's got some transitions between certain colors, and they're doing that a la poupée. One person getting the paper ready, one person getting the press ready. I think some of that moves a little bit faster and can be more fluid and actually more exciting to watch in that sense. Whereas the process of the artist coming up with some of the imagery or the marks that they want to make or the kind of techniques that they want to use to create these different kinds of images, I think that's really slow. It has to be in a way that there's a lot of experimenting. It's the proofing process. This is what I personally hated about printmaking when I was in college, is that you did not know what you were going to get until you were at the very, very end of the process. And so for me as a painter, or now I'm making collages, it's like I see what happens immediately. You make a mark and you see what happens, and then you can react to it. And in printmaking, there's a little bit of that going on, depending on how you're working on the plate or drawing on the stone or whatever it is, but you really don't know what it's going to look like until you get to the end. And so that was the frustrating part for me, but for a lot of printmakers and artists that are interested in printmaking, that's where you open up these possibilities for understanding and slowing down the process to really get to a place that they normally, or that they wouldn't think that they could get to in the first place. You pull that first proof off and you pin it up on the wall, and they sit back and they look at it and they're like, well, what if we introduce this, and what if we introduce that? And that's when the collaboration goes on. And I think there's probably some hot spots where a lot of that stuff is moving fast, but I think some of it can be very slow. You pin it up and maybe even just sleep on it, come back into the workshop with fresh eyes and look at those proofs and figure out if there was a problem that you could solve, or if it's not really a problem at all and it's a happy accident, then you should embrace whatever's happened. But this whole entire process where you're just doing stuff and you don't know what it's going to look like until the end is just kind of insane to me as a printmakers are a very particular kind of breed. I almost they're not quite like photographers, like the old school darkroom photographers. In that case, you don't really know what you get until you develop that negative, and then you develop the imagery in the darkroom. But yeah, printmakers, man, they have this incredible amount of patience. I think that's one of the most fundamental qualities of a printmaker, and I don't have that. But I like looking at prints and talking about prints and knowing them and all of that good stuff. So that's my hat.
Oh, that's funny.
I've done doing it for 15 years, and sometimes it feels like maybe I only have like 5 left in me. It's just a really, really, really fast-paced situation in New York, and New York, just as a city, is a grind. And so being young in this city is much easier than being older, even though I'm not old. But
I was gonna say, you're hardly old.
I am, it's a lot. So, but it's also, I recognize the privilege of being in this position that I am, and it's a dream job for a lot of people, and it's changed my life in all of these different ways of, meeting different kinds of people and developing these relationships in the printmaking community, with an artist outside of the printmaking community. When I first moved to New York, it was like I wanted to go to grad school. Like my point was to get a job in an art gallery and to make a little bit of money on the side so I could pay the rent and get that portfolio together so I could go get an MFA and possibly become a professor or a scholar or some kind of and all of that changed once I moved to New York and I got a job with Joni, and she was just like, the financial crisis has just happened. Like literally my first day working was September 13th, 2008. And that's when Lehman Brothers collapsed. So the whole entire economy just kind of came crumbling down. And I was like, okay, I thought that would be like the revolving door. I would just be like, all right, everything's going to go out of business and I'll see you later. But Christina Weyl, who was the director at the time, she went to Rutgers to pursue her art history PhD. And that opened up this opportunity for me to step into the director position. And I had a kind of like a quarter life crisis about it. I was like, I don't want to be the man. I don't want to be like an art dealer in New York City. I wanted to be like an artist in my garret, smoking a cigarette and thinking about, the cosmos and art history and all of these things. And, I had an identity crisis about it. But I reached out to a few people, and one of them was James Sienna, who I had met at an artist residency called Yaddo upstate. And he was just like, you just maybe Gemini's your grad school. And my old professor from Arizona, he said exactly the same thing. He was like, you've got a really great opportunity to build up these relationships with these artists in a way that's not like a traditional gallery where we're just going to the studio and taking everything that they're making on a certain period of time and putting it up on the wall. It's like, this is about collaborating and making art. Like there's a workshop where the artists go to and we make art, and then we show the art that we've helped, collaborate on with these artists. So I had a kind of like aha moment where I realized that taking that position and running with it and having a studio practice on the side was totally possible, but it was also like one of the best decisions I've ever made. But like a lot of younger artists will come up to me and like, oh, well, should I go to grad school? And to me, it's such an individual choice for somebody to consider whether or not they want to pursue more art history or more painting or more printmaking, as opposed to getting a job and doing things on the side and trying to pay the bills that way. So even though I didn't go to grad school and it was perfect for me, going to grad school is oftentimes a really, really great thing for people. So I don't have like one strong opinion about it either way. But Gemini became and still is my grad school. So
That's a great segue into your own work. Tell us what you're up to these days.
I'm making paper collages. They're very painterly. They come from the skills that I developed as a painter. But instead of my own brush work or my own kind of imagery, I'm pulling images from all of my favorite artists, pulling images from different kinds of pop cultural references that go all the way back to cave paintings, and trying to find harmonious connections between them. So I'm trying to bridge these gaps that really there's no gaps in between nature and culture, because everything kind of comes downstream from nature. But these connections that I find, like you can take like a nice little geode and it's got all these beautiful facets of gems, and I can find a real nice spot where a cubist painting clicks together. Yeah. And so the lines and the tones and the colors, I try to find really sort of smooth, harmonious connections between these things that seem to be coming from disparate areas of culture and nature.
Your collages are very complicated and super colorful, and I think they're fabulous.
Thank you.
But adding the layer of connection and meaning between the pieces of other images that you've ripped out. I've seen you ripping things on your Instagram. That's like a whole other, that must take forever.
I've gotten very quick at it, though. I feel like I've been doing collages for 10 years now. And in the beginning, I was doing it by cutting things out with an X-Acto blade and using scissors and stuff like that. And there was something that I didn't quite like about the hard edges of everything. And I also was getting frustrated because it wasn't moving fast enough for me. So this kind of goes back to like the patience that I did not have for printmaking, but trying to find these shortcuts that not only served me in a time sense for how much, because I don't have the same kind of time that a full-time artist has. So like I'm here in the gallery from at least 10 a.m. to at least 6 p.m. So when I go home, the last thing that I want to do is write an email that's like, trying to sell my own work or try to apply for a fellowship. I want to get my hands busy in the studio. I find an enormous amount of joy and pleasure from the craft. So tearing out the pages and all the little individual elements by hand, and the way that I pull the tear away from it gives a really kind of chaotic and messy and frayed edge. So when I put those frayed edges together, they really melt into each other. So there's this thing where you don't quite know where one image begins or ends. And that's really what I'm going for. But tearing them out by hand, it serves that aesthetic purpose, but it also saves me a lot more time when I'm in the studio.
Right.
The collage that I was doing before that, the really, really political piece, which is basically a portrait of Donald Trump as president of the United States, that started off by really quick stuff by hand. But as the image became much more dense and chaotic, which was a reflection of what was going on during that time, I had to really kind of get back into that X-Acto blade and cut out individual characters and individual faces and different things. That slowed things down for me a lot. But yeah, if you do it for 10 years straight, every single night, you start to kind of get pretty good at it. It's like, you're just like, I always look at paintings and I'm just like, man, I really wish that I could make a painting like that. And then I'm like, well, I'll just go to the studio and cheat. I'll take images of this Matisse painting and then a Cecily Brown painting, and I'll put them together in between different images of nature. And so, I'm using other artists' brushstrokes to create my own. There is a connection in the sense for how I came into collage. And I think a lot of it has to do with working with Gemini, is that being in a gallery, you are constantly looking at images. It's just images all day long. You got magazines, art magazines coming in, Art Forum, Art in America, Modern Painters was a big one for me back in the day, going through different kinds of catalogs that the auctions are putting out. So part of my job is understanding the market. And so understanding the market, you have all these different aspects from the beginning of it, which is where we're at in publishing, to the secondary market, where things can come back to us on consignment, to the auction houses, where a lot of this kind of stuff cycles through the market and has a different kind of way of maintaining value, losing value, but you're constantly looking at those images and those records so you can understand what the market is. So I'm overwhelmed by how many images I see every single day, just by the sheer duties and responsibilities of the job of being the director of an art gallery in Chelsea. So consuming a lot of images, this was a way for me to take that consumption and to express it or externalize it in a way, to process it, to digest it. And so it kind of made sense for me to work with imagery, images of prints, images of paintings, images of nature, etc.
When you're ripping things out, do you rip things out and put the blue pictures in one box and do you stack them up, and then when you go to do a theme of some sort and you go digging for stuff?
No, yeah, I mean, this is the tough thing. I used to separate them. Like I'd have they were like my tubes of paint. I had little to-go containers of red, yellow, blue, green. Since the work is not necessarily just about transitions between color, it's also about transitions between content, I had to kind of separate things out. So I have to-go containers that are red, yellow, blue, green for art, historical imagery. I have containers that are red, yellow, blue, green for nature, pop culture. And so they're kind of compartmentalized because when I'm making a work, I don't want it to be too much about painting or too much about waterfalls or the sky or atoms or different kinds of electron microscopic images. So creating as much diversity in a small little space, to me, is reflective of what nature and culture already is. And that's kind of what I'm trying to articulate, I guess.
Okay.
So, yeah. So yeah, it got complicated.
As any good artist's art should. But one could look at your work on a screen somewhere and imagine that it's digital somehow, but your
Yeah.
stuff is actually like there's one of them because you are ripping paper and gluing. It's an, unique object.
Yeah.
What are you gluing with and onto what?
Nowadays I use just a 4-ply back mat, and I use matte medium, which is not really a glue. It's an acrylic polymer, but once it dries, it bonds to whatever it's touching. But it's a really flexible kind of waxy material. So in a way, it's like a fancy wheat paste. You're kind of coating the board a little bit with it, sticking the paper down, and then coating on the top of it. And once it dries, it's a pretty clear matte finish. But because it's just individual pieces of paper, they have a scale-like quality to them. So if you turn them in a certain kind of light, they look like scales, like on a fish or shingles on a roof or something like that. They're all laying on top of each other and moving from one little stone to the other. The handmade quality is something that I'm obsessed with. This whole conversation where everybody is obsessed with talking about what AI is going to do to the art world and change things. And that conversation, I can see how that would be very concerning to an illustrator or a graphic designer that's creating things that are meant to be consumed digitally or reproduced through a digital process and then printed out on large scales for different kinds of marketing or other campaigns. But, for me, it's like, that's not a painting. You're looking at an image that looks like a painting. Anybody who loves art, but especially printmakers, in terms of looking at the actual object, the actual piece of paper, and understanding how those marks are made and whether or not it's one of a kind or it's an addition, and how that addition can make it even more interesting because of how complicated it is. So the tactility of art or the impasto texture of a Van Gogh or something. It's like, these are the things that really turn me on. And so the handmade quality of the collages is just as important as the imagery. Even though it may look like it could have been done digitally, I'm not capable of making them digitally. I don't even know how that would work. I have to go, I'm going around the back door here, but
No, I agree with you. It'd be difficult to do them digitally. I agree.
Yeah. But it'd probably be easy. I mean, like, I've seen some of these AI images and I'm like, oh, I can see that looks a little bit like my collages or something like that. But there's always something that's a little bit too smooth about it, or too produced or something. Whereas I'm hoping that I can do some of the same things that I think a lot of painters like to do is make some marks and sit back in the chair and look at it, try to figure out where or not that image needs to go this way or that way, or if it's missing something, or if it's got too much of something and you can cover it up. So that process, that kind of touch and go and that back and forth is something that's like, I don't know. I went to art school, and so I've always wanted to be an artist. And so that process of being in the studio and being alone and thinking about all the ideas that are going into the work, the finished product is not the only part of that is good for me. And I hope that whoever sees it can feel that too.
Right. I think the handedness is super important because they're mass-produced images. So you're taking images that are reproduced in the bazillions, and you're creating a unique thing from ripping it out, and even more of a unique thing by combining them. Like, it's a cool,
it's like a deconstruction of something and then a reconstruction of the many things kind of put together. So, like a soup or a bouquet.
Well, and sometimes they do look floral. I mean, they're just they're big. They get to be big. Some of them are big. The Trump one was really big.
Yeah.
And they can be over. Did that one ever sell?
At Jim Kepner's gallery?
Yeah.
I haven't heard about it.
Okay.
So, Jim, if you sold it, call me, man. Yeah.
I know, right? I mean, it would be tough to live with that one, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty chaotic. Yeah. So I think that I try to think about, like, man, why was I, making these collages in the beginning? And I think it was really because just being here at Gemini, I was consuming so many different images all the time. And it's just part of the job to even just to understand art history. So it's not talking about just consuming all of the different editions that Gemini's published, which are quite a lot.
Right.
But it's everything. So yeah.
The other thing that aligns it nicely with Gemini is my memory of Sydney in the shop in LA, which I went to at some point, I don't know, 8 years ago or something,
Yeah.
that they take the cast-offs, the things that didn't make the cut, and cut them down and fold them into note cards, so that when you get a card from Sydney, it's actually a piece of a print that got discarded.
Yeah. I think that's the genesis of a project with Ellsworth Kelly. He was, doing a lot of prints that are, you had this opaque color within some kind of shape that he had created. So you had a solid red or a solid gray or a solid green. But then he also started experimenting with having a brushstroke texture inside them. So there would be different states of the print. So the shape itself would be printed with a different color ink, maybe something a little bit more transparent. And then the brushstrokes would be printed on top, so you could kind of see the differentiation between the solid opaque form and some of these kinds of more chaotic handmade brushstroke imagery. So when he was in the proofing stage of a print that had some of that brushstroke, a lot of these things, they're just testing out the plates and getting them, seeing if the pressure's right. And so these are discarded, but instead of just throwing them away in the trash, Gemini cuts them up into tiny cards. And so if someone calls and you wanted to take a message and say, hey, Ann Shafer called at 2:50, give her a call back, you could get that on like the back of a Rauschenberg or Julie Mehretu or something. And so Ellsworth got it on the back of one of his brushstroke textures. And so that was essentially a magnified version of his brushstrokes. And he was like, oh, we should do a project where it's just like 8 different prints and they're all different brushstroke textures that are totally magnified. And so they blow them up and they all look like light that's shimmering off of a river. It goes back all the way to Ellsworth being in Paris and looking on the Seine and then sort of seeing this moonlight bounce off and being obsessed with what water looks like, or how do you pictorialize moving water. And he even did some earlier paintings in the 50s that kind of reflect some of these kinds of black and white transitions. So it was just perfect for him. So he just named them after the different large rivers of the world, and an entire project, Genesis, kind of comes from these cut up little note cards. But I have them in my desk. I've got like all the Elizabeth Murray's and all these kinds of things, and it's like I don't write notes on them though. I'm like, these are too precious. I kind of keep them to the side.
Well, yes. We the BMA received as a gift one of those Kelly Rivers pieces.
Yes.
And it is still there, obviously, mounted on 2 aluminum panels that had to be, hung. I think it was side by side. Maybe it was on, I can't remember.
These are top and bottom, yeah.
Top and bottom, yeah. And they were big and heavy and scary because the images go right to the edge. And so storing them, on the screens with the paintings, you're just terrified that some, buddy accidentally will bang into the edge. And it was, but they are beautiful.
And with Ellsworth's work, it's like you get like one tiny little dot in the margin of the paper, and that's like the only thing that you can stare at because everything else is so pristine.
Right, exactly.
Or some other artist like Rauschenberg, he'd be like, I'll leave it. Don't worry about it. It's great.
Right. The note cards always make me think about the many proofs that get discarded and the just crushing feeling I get when I think about you guys standing by the dumpster ripping them up. You guys don't rip up as many as other places, I guess, because you're making note cards out of them. But oh my God, it's just, I know the artist doesn't want the blah, 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 but it's so much work and time.
I know. It's like, that's the proofing stage. I feel like that's the part that, for me, it's like, that's what impresses me so much about our printmakers in general. It's just the ability to keep going at it, to keep trying to get to that point where that print is exactly what the artist intended it to be.
Right.
So like setting up those really, really high standards and really going for it. And it's kind of wild. I hear about it sometimes. I'm like, wait a minute, these Richard Serras that we're publishing, like the paper is massive. It's like Japanese kozo. It's made in Japan. It's shipped to us on these pallets on a slow boat. And I'm like, each of these sheets of paper has got to cost like $300 to $500 a piece. And so like, there's a little bit of pressure there, no pun intended, for the printmakers to like really, to not blow through 15 sheets of paper, when you're doing a project.
Right. Yeah. Get the plate warmed up with some other kind of paper.
Yeah, exactly. I have heard stories too of like artists working on a slab of limestone, and then they're going to this proofing stage where, they change things ever so slightly from each one. It's like at a certain point, you got to hit go. You got to go and print this thing, otherwise you're not going to get a full edition. So sometimes we get these prints. I'm like, man, why did we only do 32 of these? And they're like, well, they ran that stone through the press a couple times and fragility of the surface and it's fugitive. So, but yeah, so depends.
Do you guys as a habit produce a proof of each state of an etching if it's like a Julie Mehretu, like one of each of the plates so that you can see everything?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some of those kinds of things I'm not privy to because I'm not there at the workshop on a day-to-day basis, but I have seen, different stages of projects, whether for any artist, where it's like, maybe it's a photograph that Sydney had taken of them in the workshop where something's pinned up against the wall. And I'm like, what is that? That looks like a totally different state of the print that actually was published. And it's like, well, that's where it was through that proofing process, or that kind of, the initial stages of resolving whatever the imagery was going to be. So, I mean, I think that some of those things might get signed as CTPs, like color trial proofs, but they're rarely available for commerce.
Well, I was wondering if because it's money and more paper to print the stages of an I think it's easiest to talk about with etching because oftentimes you'll have multiple plates and there will be states as opposed to other types.
Yeah.
So if you print progressives of all of those things and all of the stages, that's a lot of paper from the possible edition, that's not wasted, but it's money and time, right? Yeah. But it's so useful for education.
Yeah, and I think that some of these materials end up going to the National Gallery of Art, which is a relationship that Gemini struck up in 1984, where one copy of everything that Gemini would publish would go into their archives for posterity. And I know that sometimes we keep some of these plates by Richard Serra or something that would be given to the museum for scholarly purposes, for education, and to understand what went into them. But fundamentally, almost everything is destroyed, especially for a large project with Julie Mehretu. You've got 50 copper plates. Copper is extremely expensive. We're almost incentivized to destroy them and melt them down so we can make more copper plates, just because of how expensive it is to get that material. Sometimes when people come into the gallery, they're like, wait, so like when I buy my print, you guys make it right now and then you send it to the artist and they sign it and then I get it? And then I'm like, well, no, everything is created at one period of time, and the artist comes to the workshop and inspects them all, signs them all at that one period of time. And then they're like, well, what stops you from making more prints if you sell out and you want to sell more?
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's actually a really good question, because it's fascinating, because there's like the cancellation proof. And a lot of these, my knowledge for certain Gemini projects comes from Sydney's photographs of watching Ellsworth or Ed Ruscha like just gash through the top of a plate and completely destroy the image that they had created, and then inking it and printing that. So you have you not only have the plate that's been canceled, but you have the proof of it that's been printed, and it shows all of the different areas where the artist has destroyed the plate. Sometimes they'll draw little hearts on it and they'll like, thanks, Sydney. And it's like, and they'll just kind of have fun with it, because it's kind of a party. Like once you get to the end of that, everybody can, crack open a bottle of champagne and celebrate and destroy the thing that was the matrix that helped you create this thing.
Wouldn't the melting down of Julie Mehretu's copper plates be the cancellation? Like, did you have her cancel the plates and print them?
Oh, I think they're all canceled. Yeah. And then we always print a copy.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. Where there's it's kept in the drawers in Los Angeles, and you can always pull it out if you needed to. But it's just to finish off that project in an ethical way, in a way that's like part of the ethics of making editions, especially if you're talking about things that have a very, very, very high monetary value. And some of these things do, especially nowadays where printmaking has become much more robust and the market for it is becoming much more activated and energized in a way. And I think a lot of that has to deal with certain things that are going on in the economy, where painting and sculptures become extremely expensive, where even someone in the 1% is going to be priced out of a painting because it might be $2 million or $4 million as opposed to $750,000. And I hate to use a supply side Reaganomics term, but that stuff trickles down to the print world, of the print community and the print market. So that drives prices up in a lot of ways for some of these prints, especially if it's by an artist that's very, very well known and renowned and respected. Their market can be extremely strong. A lot of people don't realize that the percentage in which prints go up in value is the same exact percentage that some of the paintings and sculptures that the artist might be doing. But because of the way the math works, if you've got a $100,000 painting and it goes up 10%, $10,000 is a chunk of change. Whereas if you've got a $1,000 print and it goes up 10%, it's only $100. But it's the same thing. So when you're starting off at different price points, you do have the same kind of growth, but it's not as pronounced as some of the larger, more expensive things. But these are expensive now. I mean, Julie Mehretu is obviously, she deserves everything that she has. I mean, she's one of the greatest artists that has ever come around. And so, but her market is reflective of that. She's also not very old. She doesn't have a lot of material out there where, these prints that we're selling. So some of them are like $15,000 for a small dry point etching. And it's like, I can get you a Jasper Johns print for $10,000. So there's the market's kind of crazy for certain artists, and depending on how saturated their market is, depending on what the imagery looks like, how difficult it is to live with, all of these things kind of come into play here. But everything's kind of crazy right now. But it's also good for printmaking because a lot of these collectors who normally, sometimes we get people to come into the gallery and I've never seen them before in my life, and they've got their nose up in the air or something like that, and they're like, oh, what are these? Are these prints? And I'm like, yeah, these are lithographs that Ellsworth Kelly did in 1974. And they're like, oh, I only collect original works. And I'm like, you mean unique? You mean you don't know the difference between the word original and unique? Is that what you just? That's like, so like someone's arrogance and ignorance can kind of come intertwine, and it's like a death rattle when they're being, particularly snobbish about whether or not printmaking is a legitimate form of art. And so a lot of they sort of air out these insecurities about not knowing something by being confident about whether or not they
right.
think that they're posters or something like that. But
oh, God.
but I've noticed a lot of collectors are really, they become very engaged in the medium of printmaking and understanding how complex it is and the history of it. Talking about the printmaking is the beginning of the spread of knowledge in the world. I mean, without it, rich people had access to 1 or 2 books or something, or, it begins to spread not only imagery, but text. And it's like, this is like a huge deal in civilization. I mean, that's printmaking. I mean, you can kind of get into these kind of philosophical, historical conversations about the importance and the meaning of making multiple images of something. Or I hear stories sometimes from scholars that are like, oh yeah, etching started really when, knight uniforms, they had all of these kinds of different kinds of things that were burned into the armor with ferric acid. And these artists looked at it and like, well, what if we have a flat surface and we use that acid, and could we make multiple images that looked like our drawings? And it's like all of that stuff. It has connection between technology, the state of different kinds of understanding of knowledge, and whether or not you want to spread it. And it's just, I don't know, it's endlessly fascinating. So that's printmaking.
That's right. No, I agree. And it's also entirely connected and intertwined with commerce. So it's the art side of it versus the commercial side. Sometimes they bump into each other, and people have a hard time with that. So it's kind of an uphill battle, but I always have said, once I get you in over that speed bump, you'll be a fan for life.
I mean, I have respect for some of these, there's printmakers that are also their own salesmen. They're printing, but they're also selling the prints. And so there's oftentimes a disconnect between those two skill sets. For me, I'm not making any prints. I'm not involved with that process that's in the very, very beginning. So it frees me to kind of just completely run with this role, where it's to exclusively represent Gemini and to do nothing but talk about Gemini, and to teach people about printmaking, to teach people about the history of these different artists that have gone to different workshops, and to ultimately try to sell this work. This is a beautiful thing that happens. I go to these collectors' homes that I've helped develop these collections, and it's like you get to develop these friendships with people where it's like you're all looking at the wall and you're like, oh, remember when you bought that weird Bruce Nauman from me back in 2010? And they're like, oh yeah, you told me that I really needed to get it, and I didn't know, and I'm so glad that I have that now. And it's like every time I look at it, I think about something new. There are some collectors where the monetary value of thing is not important. Of course, these things are important on the front end, and you have to pay for them and acquire them. You have this whole entire commercialization of art that once you get past some of that stuff, if you have the privilege to, it's like these collections that some people build it changes them in a lot of ways, because you're living with art by great artists that you normally may not be able to afford a painting of, but you're getting something that is original, that the artist made on a stone or on a plate, and it's their hands, but it's also the printmaker's hands. So yeah, it sparks up all of these different conversations that are for me quite nourishing.
Well said. Oh, I like that, nourishing. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Do you think the big Julie Mehretu that you guys just did, is there a discussion in the beginning about scale and intentionality of it going to institutions and sort of enabling museums to acquire one at a painting scale for not a painting price? Like, is that part of the conversation?
I don't know if it's a part of the conversation in the beginning, but it's certainly a reality when you get towards the end. So now we're kind of like in this market thing here. So Julie's a really good example. The first project that we did with her was also, I think it was a 10-panel etching. It may have been 8 panels, but it was a very, very large and ambitious project. It was called Auguries. It was the biggest print that she had ever made. It was one of the largest etchings that Gemini had ever made at the time. And so when she created this, it also coincided with this period in her market where the paintings started to really kind of skyrocket. And I remember we had this opening for her at 980 Madison in 2010. And we also had an opening, I think, at Lincoln Center. They have like a little side gallery next to, the symphony orchestra spaces. So that night, one of her paintings had sold for like 7 figures. It was like the first time it had achieved, I don't know, it was like 1.2 million or 2 point something million. And she was, at the time, she's younger than I am right now. She must have been in her late 30s or something, and she just kind of came into the opening and she was kind of like freaked out about it. Like, where do you go from there? Some of these artists, their prices go way up high and then their markets crash and everybody forgets about them and they kind of get kicked underneath the rug. And she was just kind of like, man, she just had finished this huge print that was totally affordable for museums and institutions that could not access the paintings. So whether or not the paintings were too expensive or there was a waiting list to get some of those paintings through her dealers, that large-scale print was a good way for museums to acquire something really significant and special by the artist. And so, the BMA acquired one.
We did.
Whitney acquired one. LACMA got one. A ton of museums on the inside of the country got them. I mean, most of that project went to museums.
Is that right?
But then, as all these other subsequent projects come along, some of those things start to go to private collections. And some of those private collections, a lot of these collectors will set up foundations or their own kinds of institutions. There are all of these different kinds of incentives to do that for tax purposes. But they also will sometimes promise those acquisitions as gifts to museums. So in a way, they're kind of offsetting some of the financial stuff that an institution would have to take on by acquiring something and living with it and then donating it to the museum. There's all kinds of tax incentives for that kind of stuff. You could get deep into the weeds of that kind of thing. But the new work that she's got, it's like, MoMA got one, and I think the Harlem Museum got one.
The Studio Museum?
The Studio Museum, sorry. But it's a $450,000 print.
I thought it was $250. It's $450?
It's $450.
Holy crap.
Yeah, and the frames are $25,000 because they're welded steel and there's Optium anti-glare plexiglass. So it's really $475,000. But, if you come and talk to me, I can work on a little thing. Maybe a 10% discount or a payment plan.
As I recall, Auguries hit the market at 60.
I think it was around there. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the time the
BMA that was a lot of money. I was like,
it
whoa.
was.
Like, how are we going to sell these? And then, the market I find to be somewhat pragmatic in a lot of ways. It sort of communicates what's possible to you. There's a lot of things that become a challenge when you're trying to initially price a project. And, Gemini, we don't price things based off of how much it costs to make it. So, there's a lot of other projects for younger artists where their prints are only like $1,800 a piece or $2,200 a piece. And you certainly aren't recouping a lot of the costs that are associated with having the artist out at Gemini. And we're kind of a traditional, almost like a residency style program. The artist comes out, we put them up in a hotel, we pay for their meals, we try to make them as comfortable as possible. Show them a good time around Los Angeles. A lot of artists in New York, they love to come to LA in January and February. They rent a convertible and they're at Gemini every day. And if you free up the artist from thinking about some of these more mundane things about everyday life, then they can get super focused on creating a new project or, really wonderful body of work. So that's kind of how it works. But like, yeah, man, I mean, it's like some of these projects, the cost for making them, you don't really get it back until later on as the prints start to sell out and the prints start to go up in value and the artist's career starts to become much more robust in terms of their value, both monetarily and intellectually or aesthetically. So there's all these factors that go into how you initially price something, the scale of it, the edition size, where the artist is in their career. But there is kind of a science to it. And I mean, sometimes it's a gut, it's like, it looks like a $40,000 print, or maybe that's $7,000, let's check it out. And so as they sell, then you sort of get more scarce in how many impressions you have left. And so you kind of increase the price as things sell out. It's a little bit like a bell curve.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay. Because the photo people always do that. The first 3 of 12 is 3,000, the second 6, and it just kind of goes up in this step thing, which I always found obnoxious. But I can understand it.
It's like a reality. It's like sometimes people come in and they're like, "Wait a minute, so this is the last copy that you have available, and is that why it's priced at $15,000?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's it. Yeah." But at the same time, it's like I can't, part of the economy of running a workshop and how expensive it is. I mean, if you've got 10 to 12 printers there full time, all of the paper, all of the ink, keeping the lights on, insurance, taking care of your employees, taking care of the artists, I mean, all of that stuff really adds up. And it's like, sometimes I hear about how much it costs to run Gemini on a monthly basis. And I'm like, man, I got to sell some more prints. It's like that's, so it can get, it's expensive. So as things sell out, it's just a natural, pragmatic part of what the market does. It sucks because there's a million coulda, woulda, shoulda stories. Everyone's like, "Oh man, I saw this one print back in 1984 and I should have gotten it. I don't know what I was thinking. It's worth so much money now." And I have a lot of those stories myself, but usually what happened is that you didn't have that money back then in the first place. And so it was impossible for you to get. But you do have this kind of knowledge of how things were priced many years ago. And but it also incentivizes you, like when you see something really special, a print that you really, really love, and you can try, get close to affording it, and it's not like gonna kill you. You just go and you get it and you grab it. Yeah, and you frame it and you put it on your wall, and then you grow with it, and then So, but don't collect for money. This is the other thing too. Is like people come into the gallery, especially if they're new money, if they're some kind of hedge fund bro or something like that. They're thinking about things. They're thinking about things in the monetary sense, and I try to kind of pull them away from that without dragging them, without them knowing it. It's like you should have some kind of reaction to this. It's a visual thing, but what is it doing up there in your brain? Like, how are you feeling when you're looking at this? Like, yes, this will go up in value over time, and maybe this one's not as important, but we never advise people to buy things based off of how much they're going to be worth or how much we speculate they're going to be worth. I mean, these conversations are a reality of the art market, but they're also just so boring sometimes. It's like, let's talk about art. Let's talk about ideas. Let's talk about process,
Yeah, I've always said that to people also, like, to buy because you love it. Don't wait for it to rise in value. So,
and if you can't afford it, just let the image burn itself into your brain. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of prints that have gone by. I'm like, I really would love to have that. But, the realities of how much wall space there is in this old house.
Yeah.
I have to start deaccessioning soon, I think.
That's when you give the donations to the museums,
That's right. Yeah. I don't know. I don't have a museum to give things to at this point. This morning, we dropped an episode with Naomi Huth, who is the chief curator at New York City Health and Hospitals. And I was thinking, maybe giving to a hospital makes sense,
Yeah. I mean, we work a lot with the Cleveland Clinic, and they place art in the hallways. And I sometimes get, people coming into the gallery and they're like, "Gemini, I've heard of that before. Where have I heard of that before?" And you're like, "Oh, I don't know." And then they figure it out. They're like, "Oh, I was going through chemotherapy, and at the hospital, there was these beautiful Joel Shapiro prints. And I recognized that little symbol at the bottom of the paper." And they're like, they were just lovely to look at on a day-to-day basis. And that's a beautiful thing. So like, yeah, placing them in a hospital is like, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think so too, because I don't know, museums are a place of privilege, even though the BMA might be free. The intimidation factor is so huge, and just kind of surreptitiously getting art into people's lives as they're waiting for, something to happen in a hospital. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's like one of the foundational kind of principles of making multiples in printmaking is that you're spreading this work out. A lot of people they say that it democratizes things, and I don't know if that's the right word, because they still are expensive and a lot of people can't afford some of these prints, but getting them out there in different kinds of ways. The show that we have on right now, which is generously on loan to us from Jordan Schnitzer, his foundation is about, acquiring all of these prints, framing them up, and paying for the crating, paying for the shipping to go to these different museums around the country that may not have the budgets to borrow things or may not have the kind of savviness or the connections to get different kinds of shows from some of the larger institutions that are on the coast or whatever. But, it's like he's kind of like sprinkling this stuff around, and it's teaching a whole new generation of people to not only be enthusiastic about printmaking or to enjoy what printmaking is, but maybe even get involved with it as an artist. And all of these things, you don't know how important they can be until a couple of years down the road when the energy kind of comes back to you through stories. So I do find that kind of, amazing about printmaking. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Jordan, I think he's doing a lot for the ecosystem. And as I like to say, everybody's got a role in this play we're doing here.
Yeah.
But I think generously spreading those shows around is part of it for sure.
Yeah. But the art world is like a country club in a lot of ways. There's kind of these gates that, where our space is open. Everybody can come in here free of charge and look at all of this work. But, the kind of social part of the art world can be very alienating to someone who isn't living in New York or LA or something like that. I mean, I feel like my parents, they kind of understand what I do. I mean, my dad was a welder and my mom was a grocery store clerk. So it was like, I come from a very blue collar, middle class family. And, when I changed my major to painting, my mom was like, what are you going to do? Paint houses for a living?
Oh,
and, it's like, and I was like, oh, fuck that. It's like, and so being from that world and then coming to this world, it's glaringly obvious that there's definitely a social hierarchy in the art world that can be very intimidating or even foul, like, just repulsive in a lot of ways. It's like high school with money. Printmaking, again, going back, I'm trying to make these bridges. It's like that's a community that's way, way, way more open because of the inherent collaborative aspects of it. There's just many, many more people that are interested and connected because of the medium than there would be any other medium for me. It's really printmaking is the most communal of those.
Yeah, I think you're right. I always hear parallels with ceramics in terms of sort of, not knowing what it's going to look like and that kind of thing. But I think in terms of the collaboration, I mean, yes, you have to have a shop and a kiln and all that, but it seems like printmaking is a little bit more complicated and more hands in the pot, whatever.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. That's the good stuff.
Yes, it is good stuff. Yeah. And as we all like to say, print people are the nicest people.
They sure are.
I'm going to keep saying it.
Yeah.
So anything you want to let us know about coming up in your future or Gemini's future that we should know?
Good question. We've got a new project coming out soon. I hope, fingers crossed, by an artist that we've never worked with before. I can't say who it is, but that's a big deal because Gemini, it's such a legacy institution where, once we start working with an artist, we really go deep. We keep inviting them to come out and do new projects. And so there's something great about that. You develop a relationship with an artist and you keep exploring and keep going. At the same time, it sort of limits you from experimenting with other artists because the workshop is booked up, because you've got these physical and time constraints that are associated with different artists' work. So this new project they're just so gorgeous. Lithographs with kind of like deboss and embossing areas. And they make perfect sense with this artist's other work that they show. So I'm excited about that. And we are resolving four large scale prints with Julie Mehretu.
Oh, great.
When I was talking to Case Hudson, when he was in town for the IFPDA print fair, he was telling me that one of the prints has 200 colors in it. And I was like, that's impossible, Like
unless
once you get to like
print.
that many colors, you can't even see the differences between some of the transitions. So that sounds complicated. And then we've got 2 new projects with Richard Serra that are coming out soon. always with Richard Serra. I've got the Richard Serra workshop, basically, and one wing of Gemini. But yeah, some of that stuff, unfortunately, because I'm on the other side of the process, I'm sometimes the last to hear about stuff. I'm like, oh, wait, I heard from someone in Chelsea that they said that they heard that they were visiting Gemini and they might do a project. I'm like, who was it? It's like, so, or all the other printmakers will text me. They're like, hey, yeah, I heard that you guys are might work with this artist, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome. That sounds great. So.
Yeah, we always felt like that at the museum. Like the trustees would know and the press releases would go out, and then finally they'd be like, oh, by the way, staff, we're doing this project. You're like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, every print shop I haven't talked to them all, obviously, but of a certain scale and of a certain lineage, everybody operates in such different ways.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating. And I think, it's all worthwhile. And you as part of that end of it, but also this commercial business side, you bring this other.
I mean, that's an interesting conversation because it's like, I sometimes I was talking to Phil Sanders about this, and he was like, sometimes you can just tell, even if an artist is made a print with, say we keep talking about Julie Mehretu, but you can tell what she's done with Greg Burnett. Like Greg Burnett has got this amazing skill with small scale etchings, dry point etchings, sheen collé. I was with Case Hudson at MoMA for the Jacob Samuel show, and it's like, these are all different artists, but these are Jacob Samuel prints. There's something that each workshop has that an artist will latch onto. And so, when certain artists come to Gemini, scale might be a thing that they know that they can take advantage of with us because we have such a large workshop. Whereas when they go to another printmaker, say Niels Borch Jensen in Copenhagen, he's got these different kinds of skills that they can utilize. And it's interesting. You have different artists in each workshop, but you have a style that comes out of that shop. And a lot of that has to do with the master printmaker that's working on those. So it bleeds into the work in a way. It's not a subconscious thing. It's like a physical skill that kind of is imbued in the work through the artist. I don't know. There's something kind of amazing about that connection.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I know we keep talking about Julie. Sorry, Julie. Maybe Julie would like to come on Platemark. She came to the IFPDA fair, and I had to run to the train, so I missed her talk. But she came to see you and the prints and to give a little spiel, which looked really fun. And then it looked like she wandered around and looked at stuff.
She did, yeah. I mean, she was there. We were like, Case Hudson's going to be in the booth. We're going to try to talk about your prints, and there's no pressure. And she was like, I'll be there. Her and Case have got a beautiful thing going on. They just, I don't know. It's like they can finish each other's sentences in not in the verbal sense, but in a printmaking sense. So they have a really great thing. But yeah, after she was done, I saw pictures where she was like going over to Harlan and Weaver's booth and looking at Nicole Eisenman etchings and being like, holy shit, how did you guys do this? I mean, she's a printmaker, she looks at things in that kind of light, which also allows you to appreciate, like Harlan and Weaver, man, those lines that Felix can get, they're just like so thin and crisp, just like, I don't know. It's like, it's a Harlan and Weaver print, you just know that it's like, even if it's a different artist, you can tell the difference between James Sienna's prints there are just so gorgeous. It just,
yes.
Yeah, they do good work. So sometimes I'm jealous. So also like someone will release a project and I'm like, man, I wish we published that. That's really beautiful, But there's no jealousy in this, it's like, don't let any of that kind of stuff get in the way. It's really, you're kind of proud of your colleagues and your friends in the community and for what they've been able to accomplish. And you wish nothing but success for them because you want to see all the different kinds of work that they can produce and publish. So,
well, right. And we want to see the whole sector survive, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Because it's, it's hard to pay New York rents selling prints. I mean, it's just,
No,
that's almost impossible.
Yeah. You're slumming it at that point. I mean, but that's the thing. It's like you got a side hustle that can help you sort of pay the bills to allow you to do the things that you've dreamed of doing or that you want, that you have these different goals and objectives that you might not be able to accomplish unless it's hard work. I think that's really what it all comes down to. I mean, printmaking is hard work. Surviving in the city as an artist is difficult. And so sometimes it feels like you just got to keep at it longer than everybody else. And then at a certain point, things can start to click. But when I first moved to New York, I was always like, I wanted to get a solo show showing my paintings, but my paintings were bad. And then I realized my paintings were bad. So I started making collages. And I've just gotten to the point in my life where I feel like I'm in a good spot right now with them. And then I'm like, but I've never had a solo show in New York. But then I'm like, Chris, remember back in undergrad and you found out that de Kooning didn't get his first solo show until he was 42 years old? You still have time. You still have time. It's like, you got to be patient, and focused and work hard. I think that those things are very important, especially if I'm, giving advice to younger artists or younger printmakers. Just keep at it.
That's your advice.
Yeah. And because it's like, you love doing this. So why would you stop doing that? Just keep your nose to the grindstone. It's easier said than done, but know that you can do it.
Okay. My advice is always get over your public speaking fear as soon as you can.
Oh, yeah?
Because you'll end up on a camera talking to me someday and you'll be blah, blah, blah.
One can only dream, but I've done it. Now I've reached the apex.
I mean, geez, when I was a young curator at the National Gallery, I gave one Sunday lecture towards the end of my 7 years there. And I was so nervous and I was just, it was terrible. And it wasn't until I, started teaching at the BMA's print room, hosting classes and stuff that I finally did it enough that now I don't worry about it at all. But It took a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I introduced Case and Julie at the print fair, I think I blacked out. Like, I don't remember what I said. Like, like everybody's like, you did a pretty good job. And I was like, yeah, was it? Like I don't even know what I said, You get in the moment and it's so intense and you're so excited. I'm like introducing these two legends, And so, but at a certain point I was just like, take it away, folks, because I stepped out,
I blacked out one time when the first big artist interview I did when I sort of finally came into my power was Jim Dine, and he's terrifying. I mean, he's great, but he's terrifying and intimidating, right? So I was worried for a good 6 months before this all occurred, and I read everything there was to read about him, and it's like trying to make sure I represented. And after we were done, and it went well because he's kind of like my dad, and I have a kind of pokey, razzy relationship with my dad, and I knew I could do that to Jim, and it all worked out. Afterwards, my boss, the chief curator, Jay Fisher, came up to me and he said the nicest thing he ever said to me, and I have no idea what it was now.
Oh, no. But you know the feeling. The feeling that you, like, when you have that. You're like,
right, that's all I've got.
That's the aura of whatever he said, yeah. Well, yes. At least you have that. Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, maybe we should wrap it up. We've been talking for an hour and a half.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on Platemark. You have been a delight. So I knew you would be, and I so appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fun. Anytime. How can I reproduce that feeling?
Oh, you're pushing it.
All right.
All right, I'm turning it off.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Platemark with Chris Santamaria. Thanks to him for being a wonderful guest. I enjoy him thoroughly. He makes me laugh. And let's see. A thank you, as usual, to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music, and one to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for his help with sound editing. Thank you also to Skip Barnhart and Lee Turner for the studio sounds that make up the soundscape at the top of the pod. Thank you both for those. If you value the content I'm producing here at Platemark, it's just me, please consider going over to the website, platemarkpodcast.com, and hitting the support and donate button. It would help me keep the lights on, and I would appreciate it. All right, I think that's it. We'll see you next time.